GLOBIS.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the session on geopolitics in Asia. And I'm sure that this is going to be a very exciting session. And we have excellent panelists from Canada, United States, India, and also from China. And I would like to get best out of this very short 45 minutes of cross discussion and leave it to you for 15 minutes of Q&A. Well, geopolitics in Asia, to my sense, it's become more multi-dimensional. And whenever we talk about geopolitics, we always talk about the rise of China, India, re-emergence of Russia, and also the distribution of powers to the middle power. I think these are the structural kind of changes that is underway when we talk about the nature of the international relations as of today. But when we look at the snapshot of the issue, if it was 5 years ago, probably we focus more on Japan-China relationship because we had a lot of disputes over Senkaku and East China Sea, and the management of Japan, Beijing, Tokyo political dynamics was one of the huge issues that we encountered. If it was 2 years ago, probably the main topic that we would have discussed might be the South China Sea, because China has been expanding its influence by reclaiming its artificial islands. There's been a lot of disputes between China and ASEAN, coastal nation of ASEAN, and also that expands the wider kind of geopolitical tension between United States and China. And a lot of issues were there. If it was a year ago, last year, probably one of the biggest geopolitical risk we had was the United States. The uncertainty of what United States would view the world would be one of the tectonic kind of impulse that we had when we talk about the risk of today. But as a snapshot, I think we cannot really avoid, to start with, by discussing on North Korean geopolitical challenge as of today. A lot of things has happened. I think we've been overwhelmed by a lot of news and events and provocation by North Korea. So I really like to take this opportunity to share the views of those panelists by looking at the North Korean challenges for first 10 to 20 minutes. So I'd like to start by asking Jim. I think there has been a lot of numerous commentaries over past weeks that U.S. might seriously think about the strike option against North Korea, or United States might eventually try to negotiate with North Korea, or United States might seek for the new status quo with North Korea. What is actually going on in those kind of debates in the United States to deal with current North Korean situation?
Thank you very much, Ken, and thanks to GLOBIS for the invitation, and most of all, thanks to all of you for coming here. There were some other panels to choose, so we're delighted you came to this one. I guess my answer to you gave 3 options for the United States, and I guess I would answer none of the above. I think the first thing, it's important, I think we all recognize that North Korea is extremely unlikely to voluntarily give up its nuclear weapons and its strike capabilities. That's just a fact that we have to accept. So what do we do about that? I think we need both a long-term and a short, medium-term strategy. Our long-term strategy will be to maintain our objective of seeing a nuclear-free Korean peninsula, but acknowledge that's a long-term strategy. It's not going to happen next year. It's not going to happen very soon. It doesn't mean we abandon that strategy, but we need to really think more about our medium-term strategy. And I would say our medium-term strategy is one of to contain and to deter. And so what do I mean by that? Deterrence actually has worked on the Korean Peninsula for 60 years. The US-ROK alliance and the US-Japan alliance have served to deter aggressive actions on the part of North Korea, and so we've had a very success in that, and I think that will continue. But it does show how U.S. alliances are an important part of the equation, and that's why the Chinese double freeze proposal is not appealing to the United States, because it would undermine our medium-term strategy of deter and contain. So I think there's sort of four things that the United States, in partnership with its allies and also its partners like China, need to do. The first is the defend word, and I think the United States will seek to strengthen its alliances with Japan and the ROK, because it's only natural that when threats against someone increase, you have to increase your ability to defend from those threats. Second, I think it's important to continue to sustain the pressure on North Korea, but it's important to recognize that the tactic of pressure is not an end. The goal is not having pressure on North Korea. Pressure is a means to an end, and the end would be to get to a point someday in the future, and this is the long-term strategy, where North Korea will decide its behavior is counterproductive. That's not going to happen soon, but that's the reason we're maintaining pressure and increasing pressure. Three, this is again in recognition of our long-term strategy, we have to start preparing for negotiations. Now, this is psychologically hard for people. How can we possibly talk to North Korea? If we keep in mind that the pressure tactic is a means and not an end, the only reason we're doing this is because someday we hope we can get to negotiations. So now is the time for the United States and its partners and allies in the region to start thinking about what sort of negotiation do we want? If we're looking for a phase solution, for example, step one might be a freeze, what are we willing to trade for that? Because by definition, a negotiation means each side brings something to the table. I don't think we've adequately thought through that, and I think we need to have more discussions about preparing for eventual negotiations in the long term. But four, and this is the most important point, is the contain strategy. This is the more medium-term strategy. North Korea is posing a threat, so we have to figure out how we contain that threat and how we deter that threat. Personally, I think much of the debate recently has been over the missile threat, and I think that's a mistake. I think the biggest threat to Japan, the biggest threat to the United States, the biggest threat to Korea is proliferation, not a North Korean nuclear attack. And we've not had adequate discussions about how do we contain that kind of proliferation. North Korea has proliferated its missile technology in the past. This is something very serious. You can deter a nation state. It's very difficult to deter a terrorist organization or a non-state actor. So in my view, that's the biggest threat, and we need to have more of a discussion. How do we work with China? How do we work with Japan and ROK? Because I think all of us would agree that proliferation is something that's a big threat to all of us, so we need to think more about that. So in sum, I would say pressure and prepare in terms of our long-term strategy, and deter and contain in terms of our medium-term strategy. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jim. It was very clear laying out policy options and your perspective on how to deal with North Korea. And I'd like to turn to Jonathan. You've been engaged in the regional affairs for long years, especially in Korea and Japan. And what do you think from perspective from like a regional neighbors, especially from Japan and Korea, to deal with the current challenges of North Korea? Jim mentioned about pressure and deterrence, and also although while preparing for the negotiation, and then to you have to be more concerned about the proliferation risks in the beyond the region. Probably that South Korea, Japan may have a different perspectives or the prioritization of to frame the issue. What do you think about this?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And, I echo a lot of the things that Jim has said. There's not one tool in the toolkit to deal with North Korea. And if you're looking for one, then you're not going to find it. So first of all, I'd like to disarm the idea of a strike option. I mean, I don't think we need to go into details about why that's a bad option, but I think there's a fundamental risk imbalance on the Korean Peninsula. The risk that North Korea is willing to take versus the risk that the US and its allies, Japan and South Korea, are willing to take. So we have to take this risk imbalance in mind when we're talking about the credibility of a military threat. The credibility of a military threat or military force is essential for deterrence. I'm not denying that. But we also have to kind of disarm this notion that this is kind of some sort of surgical strike or easy option to roll back the North Korean program, because that's simply a fantasy. One of the interesting things, Ken, that you bring up is Japan-Korea and how that could have a role on the Korean Peninsula. Because I think one of the interesting things, we focus a lot on Donald Trump's election, obviously a geopolitical change in this region. What we kind of been overlooking is the election of Moon Jae-in in South Korea, and what impact from a bilateral relations perspective does this have in the Japan-South Korea relationship, but also in this trilateral dynamic. So even though there were a lot of concerns that the bilateral relationship with Japan and South Korea might be harmed a little bit because of the election of Moon Jae-in, the reality is that because of the geopolitics of the day, especially what's happening on the Korean Peninsula, these three sides are forced to come together. So Donald Trump should be taking this opportunity to really catalyze this and to really bring these guys together. And this is something that really concerns me a lot.
Thanks so much. Now I'd like to turn to the Chinese perspective from Won-Don. I think China has been spotlighted for past 6 months, and the United States weigh on China's role probably too much from your perspective. But I think everybody likes to know what has been the China's game plan to deal with North Korea, and what has been doing well, what has not been well pursued by the Chinese government. I'd like to know your perspective on that.
Thank you, Ken. Well, first of all, I have to say the North Korea nuclear challenge, the situation on the Korean Peninsula is now is at a very critical moment, and it's quite a big challenge, I think, for everyone. But I think we should not be pessimistic about the prospects of a peaceful resolution of this crisis. And to begin to really understand, why we are at this situation, we have to understand where does the problem really comes from in the first place. And if we look at history, I think it becomes very clear that at least part of the very important reason that why North Korea wanted to pursue nuclear weapons is concerned about its regime security. It's a concern about survival, its survival of its own regime. So I think we have to have that in mind. And you want to ask where does the threat to the North Korea's regime comes from? It doesn't come from China. Doesn't come from Russia, not likely from Japan. Mostly it's from the United States. So I think we always have to bear that in mind if we want to talk about how to deal with the current situation. If we do not understand where does this problem really comes from, then we will come up with a wrong diagnosis or prescription. So I think a lot of the things we have been talking about really, you cannot just from, for instance, a Chinese traditional medicine point of view, you have to not just dealing with the symptoms, but rather you have to cure the diseases and the root cause of this problem, which is, I think North Korea's this concern about its own regime security have to be taken into account if you want to really come up with a peaceful resolution of this current crisis. Of course, I think in response to the provocations coming from North Korea, United Nations Security Councils have been put up numerous rounds of sanctions against North Korea. But I think the Chinese government, China has this understanding about sanctions. Yes, sanctions are very important, necessary. That is why China is working with the other stakeholders, international communities, to come up with so many sanctions. But the problem is that we also have to be realistic about what sanctions can and cannot do. I remember, I think not a while ago, Russian Prime Minister Putin said that even the North Koreans, they are starved to eat grass. They're not going to abandon nuclear weapons. And why is that? I think he's got a point. Why is that? Because they care about their own survival. So if we forget about that and feel like, the only problem the reason that we are at this current situation is because we have not yet put enough amount of pressure or sanctions or deterrence against North Korea. I think we are just dealing with the symptoms. We are not curing the disease. So what I'm trying to argue here is that, I think James, in your remarks, you mentioned that the reason that the United States did not accept the proposal about double suspension coming from China, the meaning the North Korea suspend its nuclear weapons in exchange for United States suspension of its large-scale military exercise. I think I understand the logic of maintaining deterrence posture and everything, but the problem is that to be very honest, I think it's a very, at least from a Chinese perspective, China has been trying very hard. Just to make an analogy, it's not really China's problem. It's like mostly between North Korea and the United States. The two, just like in a village, and the two, villagers got into fight, and China as a neighbor want to step in, try to mediate. But then, other people's stuff, like one of those people in the dispute start accusing China, blaming China. I think that's, of course, very unfair. But like the proposal of a double suspension, at least personally, I believe is very sensible, very reasonable suggestion. I mean, I really don't think that if this, mutually, this can be worked out, it will be a damage to American deterrence capability. No one, I think, in the world will doubt about the capability or credibility of U.S. deterrence. It's about the political willingness in the United States. The policymakers, political leaders, whether or not they are willing to think about that. I'm not going to say, the rejection of the double suspension proposal is very arrogant, but I do hear people, not only from China but elsewhere, sort of put up that kind of opinion. So what I'm trying to say is that there is also a limit to what deterrence and sanctions can do. And finally, of course, I very much agree with what James and Jonathan just said. I think diplomacy perhaps is the only viable options we have. And it's a very extremely complicated and difficult issue facing all of us now, but I think we have to work together. This is the only option we have, and try to find a diplomatic solutions to avoid the war and bring peace and stability back to the Korean Peninsula. I think this is the only way going forward. It's not going to be easy, but instead of, I think, blaming each other, pointing fingers at each other, I think we have to work together.
Thanks, Won-Don. Obviously, that North Korean nuclear challenges is challenge for all of us, and even China, Russia actually share the platform for denuclearization for eternal goals. But we do have a slightly different approach in the process to deal with that agenda, and I think we need to explore such kind of difference in a later debate. But before going to that, I would like to ask Narendra, because you're from India, and specifically on North Korea issue. This is also global issues, and India has its own perspective on the nuclear agenda in Northeast Asia. And what's your view on that?
Thanks for the opportunity and the invitation to this conference. You see, when we look at North Korea and this news, practically it has become a fortnightly event about missiles going in this direction and that direction. It worries us a lot. Of course, it's not happening very close to us, but there is a very close link between what's happening in North Korea and our part of the world, because technology being used by North Korea is, we are told, more or less the same, which is available with Pakistan. And there is a close, you talked about proliferation, there is a close collaboration going on between Pakistan and North Korea. And as we all know, that is not limited to Pakistan. Once it comes in the hands of the Pakistan, there are many groups which are quite autonomous, and there are many non-state players, and with very, very close ties increasingly with Pakistani army and Pakistani establishment, which means that these things can, we might find difficult to believe at this stage, but it's quite possible that worries us that this North Korea, China, Pakistan link in terms of nuclear proliferation might actually take a very different turn, and these small nuclear weapons called the smart nuclear weapons might end up in the hands of the people who may not actually listen to either to China or to the government of Pakistan, and may find their way to different other parts of the world, including Europe and beyond. And that actually worries us quite a lot. We don't understand that poor economies like Pakistan, which is a very small economy, or very small economy like North Korea, they should be wasting their resources on such things. But at the same time, it's a reality. We really honestly don't know the role that China plays in between. We don't know that. But what we do know that probably China is used as a transit for information and technology. We have no evidence of that. And here, whatever I'm saying, these are my personal views. These are not the views of the political party that I represent. Second important point, but at the same time, what we do want to make sure is that the Asia of tomorrow is multipolar, is not unipolar, is not dominated by any one country. So therefore, we are very keen as India to collaborate with democracies in this part of the world, mainly the United States, because we look at the United States as probably the biggest stakeholder in the future of Asia. And Asia and the United States share the same ocean called the Pacific. And that's why we are also collaborating quite comprehensively with Japan, with Australia, and with a number of other countries, mostly democratic countries. And we want some kind of, I would not say any kind of alliance, there is no such thing, but we want this cooperation to take a shape to ensure that Asia of tomorrow is multipolar, is not unipolar, is not dominated by any one country, Japan or India or China or United States, that is multipolar. Multipolar Asia will ensure that the world of tomorrow is more prosperous and more stable. Therefore, we think that all the stakeholders must come together, especially democracies, and make sure that Asia of tomorrow is actually run by democracy and is multipolar. Very quickly on China. China is our friend. We look upon China as a friend. We look upon China as a partner. We share a long border, close to 4,000 kilometers. We have known China for centuries. Buddhism went from India to China, and from China to Japan and to Korea and some other parts of the Far East. And we want to maintain and actually expand our relationship and cooperation with China. China has a different view of Asia. We have a very different view of the world. That's why we refuse to participate in OBOR. We think the OBOR, in terms of its outlook and its mindset, is a position in the future. I think it's more a product of a very old-fashioned way of looking at world, where one country or one group of countries tried to dominate or try to redraw the fault lines, at the same time policy lines across Asia and beyond. We think the future of Asia in particular should be basically India, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, Vietnam, Iran, and Central Asian countries collaborating. And we think there are many such platforms. For instance, Shanghai Cooperation is a very good platform. BRICS is a very good platform, which goes beyond Asia as well. And at the same time, we think that that's we recently had a standoff with China, which was fortunately resolved through negotiations. We hope that spirit is maintained, and we hope that India and China will actually be cooperating even more in all spheres, including how do we together reshape Asia with India, Japan, China, Korea, Vietnam, Australia, United States, all sitting around the table and working on a solution and making sure the Asia future is multipolar. The final point, we think that when we look at New Delhi and look at this part of the world, we think Indo-Pacific and Indian Ocean, they must work together. Countries of Indo-Pacific and Indian Ocean. On the one hand, we say it's a small world, world is a village, but at the same time, we look at Asia with a very, very different eyes. I think Indo-Pacific and Indian Ocean countries must work together. And when I say that countries must work together, that means India, United States, China, Japan, and also Africa. With Japan, Japan's Prime Minister was in India recently. He had a great stay. And I can tell you that, the visit of Japanese Prime Minister and the launch of the bullet train project in India had made practically everyone, including those who can't read and write, interested A, in Japan, and B, in this collaboration, and C, in the future of Asia, which we think is a historic moment. We plan to take this collaboration with Japan beyond economic, and also we plan to take it beyond Asia to Africa. This century, some people think it belongs to Asia only. I personally think this century actually belongs more to Africa, because both India and China will hopefully peak by 2050 or 2055, and we will still have 45 years to go. And both India and China and Japan and Korea will need Africa in order to sustain economic growth. So India and Japan have already taken the initiative in that direction by working on a kind of economic corridor between Asia and Africa through India in many ways, which we think is the better way to. So when we look at New Delhi, I would like to say my last thing, it's important to look at future, the way future is being written by companies like Google and Facebook and all these major technology. In 50 years from now, 40 years from now, how the world should be shaped, how the world should be run, may not necessarily be decided by politicians. They probably will be decided by those who are more apolitical and really want to make sure the world is secure and economically prosperous. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Narendra, that you laid out the broader perspective of your perspective in geopolitics. You've already done a job of summing up of this session as well. But Jonathan, you have additional comments, right?
Sorry to bring it back to North Korea, but two very quick points. First, when we've been talking about North Korea this morning, and we've been focusing a lot, understandably so, on the nuclear weapons program and the missile program. But I would urge us to not have what I call like the nuclear sunglasses. When you look at conventional means and also chemical and biological programs, these are also, especially conventional, is arguably a greater threat, especially to Seoul, than focusing everything on the nuclear weapons program. So that's one point that I think when talking about North Korea, we shouldn't be focusing that in threat terms only on the nuclear weapons program. The second point is, for the US side, a piece of advice is to avoid at all possible decoupling. And this is another North Korean strategy, to decouple the alliances. And the reason I say to avoid it is things that I see almost as an own goal. For example, on the Korea-US Free Trade Agreement, berating that, talking about potentially withdrawing from that all wraps up into the alliance relationship with South Korea. Now is not the time to be talking about pulling out of chorus.
Could you elaborate what the decoupling in your terminologies?
So decoupling, basically the idea that North Korea or an adversary would like to pull apart the alliances. So, the US-Japan alliance, the US-Korea alliance, the trilateral dynamic, in order to kind of, some of the concerns on one of the allies become less important to the other ally. So this is a strategy that North Korea is trying to pursue.
In relation to that, Jim, please.
Just a couple of quick points. I agree that we shouldn't be blaming each other for who is at risk, because we all have to work together. So let's sort of leave the past aside and look to the future and figure out how we can work together. I agree also with my colleague that there's a limit to the impact of sanctions, and that's why I said that's part of our long-term strategy. A sanctions policy is a tool to an end, but that end won't occur anytime soon. We have to be patient, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't use this tool. And finally, the one point I really disagreed with, though, was that the fundamental problem was between North Korea and the United States. And that is a misreading of the situation, because what that means is the United States should leave aside its allies, Republic of Korea and Japan, and try and work something out. And that's where I agree with Jonathan that from the United States, inherent part of our strategy is strengthening alliances. So we won't leave the Republic of Korea and Japan out of any eventual talks that we might have to resolve the problem.
Okay. Wonder you raise a hand, right? Yes.
Very quickly, a couple of points to James. I think, of course, China is not asking the United States to leave its South Korean allies or Chinese allies. No one is asking the United States to do so. What we are, international community and China included, what we are asking the United States to do is to give diplomacy a chance. Just like not saying, oh, double suspension, forget about it, because we want to. You do not want to make it zero-sum. Oh, once it's deterrence, it's alliances, then there's no place for thinking about diplomatic measures and ways. I think that's perhaps a thing, kind of way of thinking we might want to re-examine. And also, very quickly, I think Narendra has made a very, we do share this view that the future of Asia should be multipolar. This is a strong along. China has held, I think, this view for a very, very long time. To a great extent, I think China and India, we share this vision about the future of Asia. What I'm trying to say is that there are a couple of things. One is, I think, certainly China opposes, it's very clear, we strongly oppose and condemn North Korea's nuclear program from day one. So it's not right to say there's any link between China and DPRK's nuclear program. And we have been working very hard with the international community to try to stop that. And secondly, I think I understand, being a professor teaching a series of international relations, including realism, I do understand the reasons, logic of, balance of power and everything, why states coming together. But I think I just want to also, we have to caution ourselves about the rhetoric of ideology. I think nowadays we're in the 21st century. We are no longer in the Cold War. So therefore, thinking or saying that we should draw a line in Asia based on ideologies, those are democracies, liberal democracies, vis-a-vis others. I'm not quite sure this should be the way of thinking about, how global affairs, how the things, international relations should be run in the 21st century. And this gets to my last point, which is Belt and Road Initiative. I do understand there still has been some misunderstanding about what Belt and Road Initiative is really about. And in that regard, I think that China should do a better job in trying to explaining to the world what really this initiative is about. But one thing is very clear: it's not about China's initiative. Just like AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, it's not China's bank. It's everyone coming together. We're trying to, provide more global public goods. Everyone, we collaborate, cooperate, just like what Narendra just said. We all coming together, try to collaborate and try to work together in Asia and all the way to Africa, right? And then generate mutual benefits for everyone will be in that. So I think this is, might still be some misconception out there regarding what the Belt and Road Initiative is about. But I just want to use this opportunity also very quickly to help explain a bit of this is truly a multilateral initiative. Everyone coming inclusive. It's not just China's initiative.
Wandong, very briefly, I'd like to ask you, what do you expect Japan to play in the perspective of the Chinese regional and global strategy?
Not just Belt and Road Initiative. It's a broader regional and global strategy.
Yeah, you can mention beyond
Okay. First of all, to begin with, Belt and Road Initiative, I think China has made it very clear from the very beginning we welcome Japan to join this initiative. And of course, we are very happy to see that Japan actually sent a very senior delegation to the Belt and Road Summit of International Cooperation Summit back in May. And I think I think we do appreciate that. And in terms of Chinese understanding of Japan's role in regional and global strategy, of course, we regard Japan as a very important partner and friend. Of course, we do, have some differences, disputes between us. But I think for us to have a stable and prosperous future Asia, there's only a way ahead, which is for China and Japan to work together. If China and Japan, we cannot work together, and then I think the future of Asia will be doomed. So I think this is only that's why I think it's a responsibility of not only I think political leaders but also our scholars. And we are at this GLOBIS university and educators, students. All we come together and have to. I think it is about time for us to think about how to broaden the ties or restore the social ties between China and Japan. I remember, I think a few weeks ago, we at the Peking University we hosted a very large delegation of Japanese students, about thousands of them, coming to China. And I think, when the young students, young people, they sit together, interact, talk to each other, you will see the future of Asia is out there. So I think we have to really go beyond the current problems, some differences between us, and take a more forward-looking approach, not only in our bilateral relations, but also in terms of how we envision the future of Asia.
Great. Now we heard from Won-Dong great encouragement for future kind of Japan-China collaboration in the regional global field. Now turn to Narendra. Narendra may have an alternative view. Now he earlier said that India didn't participate in the AIIB meeting, and the recent Japan-India summit meeting we just had in Delhi, we came up with the very forward-looking joint statement. It's a lot of infrastructure, project cooperation, security and economy and so on. It has a certain kind of attachment towards what Japan and India are looking towards the future regional order. What is your take on this?
Yes, thank you. I think the take is very simple. First, I beg to disagree with my friend from China. I think to us, democracy is not a rhetoric, and it's nothing to do with Cold War or hot war or whatever war. You see, it's democracy to us, our religion, it's our faith. We sincerely believe that no society, no nation can sustain progress for a very long time, can become a superpower, or can really acquire or achieve the respect of everyone around the world without democracy. It's our belief. You can agree or disagree, that's a different matter. And therefore, when we cooperate or when we collaborate with democracies like Japan or Australia, the United States, we feel very comfortable. We feel at home. We feel we belong to the same space. While look at OBOR, for instance. OBOR, the very first project of OBOR is China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which passes through Indian territory, occupied by Pakistan. China should have just informed us. It takes just a phone call. Look, we plan to do that, or at least should have consulted India. They didn't. They just went ahead, announced, started construction, brought thousands of Chinese workers, and started work. Very insensitive to the fact that territory belongs to India, even in our map and to us. So this is, the result was that when they invited us to the summit in China, we had no alternative but to say no. While in democracy, we could have gone to that country, called a press conference, spoken with journalists, spoken with professors. In China, you can do that. But having said that, it's not any roadblock. China is a great country, great neighbor, and we are working together for a better Asia, and we are working together to expand the relationship. But at the same time, look at the other model that India and Japan are creating together. India and China, India and Japan, what they are doing is helping the businesses. In Japan Inc. and India Inc. is collaborating. Intellectuals are collaborating, university to university, youth to youth, women to women, political parties to political parties, and they are basically trying, how can we help each other? How can we grow together? How can we make sure that, Asia of tomorrow is, exactly to our dreams? So what they're trying to do now is, it has started with bullet train, but actually now it has started much before bullet train. Now the new thing that's coming up is basically another corridor that will start from northern part of India, go to eastern part of the country. And at the same time, India has a long experience of dealing with Africa, very long experience. Even Mahatma Gandhi, who was the kind of founder of, in a way, of modern India, actually spent several years in South Africa before he returned to India. So we have known Africa for millenniums practically. With our expertise of Africa, our experience of Africa, Japanese capital, Japanese technology, and India, and two democracies. So we are writing a new future. We don't have time, otherwise I could have really shared more details on that.
Great. So before going to the Q&A, I'd like to turn on Jim finally. Okay, so first is Jim. I'd like to ask about the United States. Where is the United States now? I mean, what do we know about the Trump's Asia policy? And also, we don't really have to, specifically focus on Trump, but what is the emerging United States strategy to deal with this geopolitical dynamics? I think we know a couple of major decisions made by Trump administration, but I don't think there has been the overall Asia policy has revealed right now. So provide us your perspective.
I think despite some horrible bumps in the road, there's been more continuity than change in the United States Asia policy, with the exception of trade, a huge exception. Jonathan described it as an own goal. I would just say it was worse than that. It was a huge strategic blunder to withdraw from TPP. But setting that aside, the United States, or the Trump administration, has reiterated its security commitments to allies. President Trump is meeting on Thursday with Prime Minister Abe and President Moon, which is very important to provide that reassurance in this tense moment. Also, the United States has reaffirmed the One China policy and our commitments under the Taiwan Relations Act. So I think in 100 years, if we look back, I think we'll see, despite some bumps, with the exception of trade, there's been basic continuity in our Asia policy.
Okay, Wandon, you have 1 minute.
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to echo Narendra that I think we also have this very similar feeling toward India. India is also our great neighbor, a great partner, and also, like I actually just came back from India. I flew directly from Delhi to Tokyo, attending a forum in Pune. And when I was at Pune, I also said that both China and India, we are not just sovereign nation countries. We're actually civilizations, 1,000 years of history going back. And of course, Narendra just mentioned that China actually, in a way, sort of learned you introduce Buddhism to us, and then to Japan and Korea, etc. So we do have this very strong cultural links, historical link going back 1,000 years ago, and great friendship. So if we actually look at history, I think for 99% of the times, we have very strong friendship between China and India. And looking at the future, I also would argue that India and China and other, of course, countries in Asia together, we hold the key to the future of Asia. And we respect the global ambitions of of India, just like when we look at ourselves. And little points, democracy. There's discussion about that getting a little bit of philosophical now, but I think the democracy, in my view, this is the common values. Not only that just Japan or India, United States holding to that, China is also holding to the value of democracy, of course. The only, I think, from a sort of political philosophy's point of view is that China might suggest that we might want a bit of more diversity in terms of the definition of democracy. Well, is there only one type of model of democracy around the world, or better, we think there might be a bit more diversity. And in terms of feeling at home, I just want to say that I met a friend, Chinese friend, who have spent more than 12 years doing business in India, and he told me that he feel very at home in India. He feel very comfortable, and I do hope we can have this mutual feeling actually. In China,
Okay,
Pakistan,
we need to move to the Q&A.
Yes, I'm finishing.
So
of course, that's something can be consulted, and I do hope there will be more consultation between us regarding that.
Okay, thanks so much for your time management. Okay, let's open the floor for the Q&A. Please, go ahead. Any microphones? Yes.
My name is Frank Packard. I'm involved in a boutique investment bank here. My question is for Jonathan and for Jim about perhaps an over-reliance on sanctions as a solution. This is what I'm about to say may offend some people, and it's not my view, but Bradley Martin has written about North Korea that perhaps it most resembles early Showa Japan in terms of its leadership, in terms of its hereditary power, in terms of the leaders being intimately involved with the military. And my question I wish to ask politely is, how did the U.S. sanctions in 1940 and 1941 work with Japan? I don't think they worked very well. And I wonder whether the sanctions, the UN sanctions this past week led to a second missile launch. And I wonder whether there's a creative opening to do something other than sanctions in both of your perspectives.
Okay, let's take 2 or 3 questions all at once. Shikata-san, please.
My name is Noriki Shikata from Foreign Ministry, working on, having worked on China and India during the last 1 year. My question to Professor Wang, it seems that there was, kind of division being focused in this panel discussion. At the same time, I feel that China shares some, common interest with the United States, Japan, or India in the context of, peaceful resolution of the issue, or to denuclearize Korean Peninsula, or preventing proliferation. So, but at the same time, China is getting international focus because 90% of trade with North Korea is taking place between North Korea and China. And my question to you is, what additional measures would China be able to take in order to lead this situation to a more peaceful resolution? Because it's not time to engage with dialogue with North Korea. You cannot reward unilateral escalation by North Korea. And I guess Chinese leadership feels these frustrations with the North Korean regime. So my question is more kind of constructive measures to be taken by China on this issue. Thank you.
Okay, one more question. Please, go ahead.
I have a simple question. I was listening to you.
Please use the microphone because we are recording.
I was listening to those 4 excellent panelists and the moderator, and it was very interesting. Do you feel that there is a DNA issue here? Because in the geopolitics issue, there's a DNA issue between democracies and non-democracy. Anytime I hear someone to talk to me about diversity of democracy, I'm quite worried because that means that they don't understand the nature of democracy, right? So, Professor Wang, when you talk about democracy, your notion of democracy, how can you explain how it can be aligned with the rest of the countries which are democratic in Asia, including Japan, India, Australia, New Zealand, and the rest?
Okay, for the sake of time, I'd like to get back to the panelists. Start by Jim, probably with each of you have 2 minutes each.
Thank you. On the question of over-reliance on sanctions, and now is not the time for talks, I agree with both of you, and that's why my comment was that our long-term strategy of seeking resolution of the problem involves sanctions as a tool, not an end, leading to a point where eventually North Korea will want to talk. I agree with you as well that right now we're not at that stage. We need to prepare for that moment. So sanctions are a tool that will take a lot of patience, and it'll be a long time, I think, before we can get to the stage of starting to talk about a resolution. So in the meantime, we need to have a strategy of deter and contain, particularly the non-proliferation threat, and that's why our alliances are so important.
Jonathan, on the same questions?
Yeah, very.
1941.
Yes. Hope we don't have a repeat. On the sanctions, yes, I mean, I would agree with Jim. I mean, sanctions are not a means to an end. First, I think we need to make a difference here between multilateral sanctions and unilateral sanctions as well. So I think there have been some gradual unilateral sanctions that the U.S. has now put on some Chinese and Russian entities. We might see that increase in the coming weeks. The one thing that I would say that is, you know, on the kind of negative end of sanctions is that, number one, North Korea is very used to sanctions. And number two, it's verification. So it's very difficult to verify that these sanctions are being complied with. So I read in the Financial Times a couple days ago the idea of Chinese banks now that are stopping new accounts for North Korean applicants. That's fine, but what happens when someone crosses the border over from North Korea to China, has a bag of money, and then gives it to someone and says, do you want 10% and open up a bank account? So these type of things, these loopholes with sanctions are very, very difficult to get rid of. So this is one of the biggest issues with sanctions.
Wandon, you have a question from Shikata-san, and you can also mention about sanction issue as well.
Okay. Thank you. This question, I think we should always bear in mind that, yes, today we talk a bit about the differences between China and other partners regarding how to deal with North Korea nuclear challenge. But I think we should always remember that we actually share the same goal. That's the most fundamental starting point. If we forget about that, then sort of we got trapped in differences, you know, criticizing each other, accusing each other, then that will be most unfortunate. So, so I think we share the same goal of trying to pursue peaceful resolution of the North Korean nuclear crisis. There's no doubt about that, and this is very important to remember that. China's trade with North Korea, of course, you know, but the problem is that think about, you know, it's not that China's trade with North Korea caused North Korea to pursue nuclear weapons. It's very important to also to remember that. But then you also say, oh, you know, cutting all trade with North Korea, would that stop North Korea from pursuing its nuclear weapons? Possibly not. Remember Putin's words. That got a lot of points. It's very hard reality, but we have to face with that. It's not just because you stop all trade and everything, and they will just stop pursuing nuclear weapons, because this is about their survival, and they were willing to. And also now, as James in the very beginning said, North Korea already got nuclear bombs. And when do you believe that North Korea is going to use those nuclear weapons? Of course, if we push them to the corner. So I think this is why China is very cautious in terms of, say, we have to be very careful not to make the situation sort of more intensified. And in terms of additional measures, I think China now is working with other members of the international community. We're putting, I think the UN Security Council is discussing about putting additional sanctions and everything. But above all, we believe that the diplomatic measures are very important. It's not going to happen like tomorrow, but you always have to think about the possibility of that, and that's why China has been put up so many proposals, including the double suspension proposal, and maybe 32nd DNA issue. You know, I do teach political philosophy, So I understand, where I'm not gonna, we should not get into a discussion about what's the definition of democracy, and et cetera. What I'm trying to say is that it is a spectrum. It's not a single point. Once you step to left, you are no longer a democracy, and you have to be at this specific point, and then you are a democracy. I think that kind of too much restrictive understanding of democracy might not be very helpful. And in a way, I think, like I just said, democracy is a kind of value, it's common value, to a great extent shared by many, many members of the international community, including China, Japan, India, United States. We might have a bit of definition difference in that way of how to do that, but you cannot deny that this is something we all agree. So they should be the values we all share.
Well, finally, to Narendra, probably you wish to take up on the DNA issue. But when we come to the concept of the democracy, as Wang Dong mentioned, there has been a variety of interpretations. And past 20 years, that we have expanded our world economy, very large size. But if you look at the statistic, the electoral democracy of the world has not really achieved much. It's only at 60% in 1997, and then the 2007, 20 years after, the percentage remained the same, which means economy is growing without reforming politically. And I think we have to really face with the fact. So Narendra mentioned that the democracy is like a religion, but the religion has not been spreading so much. How do you respond to that?
India's close relations with Israel. And when we look at the Middle East from New Delhi, actually the first democracy that we interact with is Israel. There's no democracy between India and Israel in between. I mean, if you unless you take Pakistan as a vibrant democracy, that's a different thing. But in my view, you see, unless you have political democracy, there can be variation. For instance, whether it's American-style democracy or British-style democracy or Greek-style democracy, and so on and so forth. You can have that. But I honestly think that democracy. What does it mean? DNA. What does it mean? It means that individual has freedom. Individual has freedom to say what he or she wants to say. Individual has freedom to do what he or she wants to do. And individual basically elects his or her ruler. So that's democracy to us. The first republic in India came into being already 2,500 years ago, called Magad Republic. That was even before Buddha was born. So to us, it comes naturally. When you look at our religion, Hinduism is probably the most democratic religion in the world. At the same time, my personal view is that unless you have democracy, political democracy, you cannot have economic democracy. And economic democracy is without economic democracy, we will not be really able to deliver the kind of world that we all want to deliver. So political democracy and economic democracy. Like I give you one quick example. In India, we have some corporations which are basically run by the board, but there are a few others which are not necessarily run by the board. But I am a great admirer of companies which are truly board-driven, and you see many of such companies in the United States and western part of the world. I think ultimately, in my view, just to conclude, that at the end of the, ultimately, maybe in 100 years from now, 80 years from now, political democracy is going to win, economic democracy will follow that, and the entire world is going to be democratic, the same way as democracy was understood by people 2,500 years ago in India or in Greece. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I recognize a couple of hands on the floor, but unfortunately we have to close the session. But I hope you enjoy today's debate. Something that I recognize is that there are so many major players in Asia-Pacific region because of the rise of many powers: India, China, Russia, Japan, and Southeast Asia. And they all have a responsible kind of stake in forming the regional dynamics. And I think that the North Korean geopolitical challenge is one of the very important test cases, how this newly emerging regional order to be created. And we all have to recognize we are responsible in responding to this threat as well. So with all these kind of lessons in our mind, something that we have to say is that we really have to continue our discussion. And I hope you stay in the G1 Global in remaining session as well to wrap things up in the final session as well. So we'd like to thank all the panelists for their excellent performance, and join me to thank them all. Thank you. Thank you very much.